In this video, I'm going to be sharing with you the answer to the big question of why. Why did I choose to have an elective induction, knowing all that I know about birth today? And why have I changed the way I approach birth since that experience? As I shared in my last video, my daughters wanted to know why. Why would I be induced knowing all that I know? My response to them, in short, was you don't know until you know. But today I'm going to tell you that there were 3 main reasons that led me to making that decision and why I no longer allow those 3 things to influence how I make decisions in my birth. I'm also going to provide you with some of my top tips for preparing for your own birth that I think will be very beneficial and make a huge difference in how your birth turns out. So if that sounds like something you want to know more about, stick around, be sure to hit that subscribe button and hit that notification bell so that you can stay up to date on my content as I go further and further into the discussion around birth, your options, and other things like choosing a childbirth education class, or how does my faith engage with this physical process that's going to be happening with me. We'll talk about all those things and other topics on this channel, but to start with, these first sets of videos are going to be surrounded all around pregnancy, birth, and preparing for your best outcome. There were 3 things that contributed to why I made the decision to have an elective induction. Number 1, excitement. Excitement. I was excited. I was ready to welcome our first little girl. From the moment I found out I was expecting, I was ready for her to be here. Excitement fueled and motivated almost everything that I was doing. And there's nothing inherently wrong with excitement being a drive. It's a strong motivator. It gets you going. It keeps you going when you're struggling with the pregnancy pains, the aches, and all that comes with it. But it led to number 2, which was impatience. Like I said, when I knew she was in my womb, I was ready for her to be out and with me so I could love on her and we could be our little family and the family could all meet her. And so not only was it excitement that grew into impatience for myself, especially in those last few weeks, but it was the excitement and impatience of my family around me, family and friends who were constantly texting me, hey, when's baby coming? When will we know? How far along do you think? Are you dilated at all? Is there any sign that maybe labor might happen anytime soon? And comments like these, again, are not inherently bad, but they can be very unhelpful when you're trying to stick to your original plan of aiming for, which I was as a first-time mom, a natural and unmedicated birth. I wanted things to happen on their own, but I still was impatient and wanted them to happen sooner than what they were doing. So, number 3 that influenced why I chose to have an elective induction was my lack of education. My lack of education surrounding what my options actually were. I thought natural and medicated birth was the standard. I thought that every provider was going to approach birth in that way, and then, if medically necessary, would offer interventions or present interventions that were going to be needed in order to continue having a healthy and happy mom and baby. What I didn't know is that that tends to not be the case, especially in the hospital birth model, which I was in. I didn't have the option of a midwife or a doula at the time because I was in the middle of nowhere, Arkansas. No one in my insurance was actually providing that kind of care, so my only option was to go to an OB. And I did have an OB that when I went to our first appointment and shared that I wanted a natural and medicated birth, presented herself as fully on board, fully supportive, and ready to support me through whatever wishes I had. But what I didn't know is that as I would share with her in my excitement and my impatience and the excitement and impatience of my family as to when was this baby going to come, she would begin to present me with possible interventions or methods of helping to speed the process up. And what I didn't know, because I wasn't informed or educated, that with those steps, that was essentially going to set me up for having to make the decision as to whether or not I would want other interventions, other things to get things going for my birth. So that's it. Excitement, impatience, lack of education. Those were the three things that led to me choosing an elective induction. And those are the three things that I no longer allow to influence how I make my birthing decisions. As my provider started offering these different options to help speed the process of labor on, to initiate labor, I was assuming that she was also keeping in mind my wishes to have a natural unmedicated birth. First, it was the offer of a membrane sweep, which I did elect to have, not knowing, because of the lack of education, the pros and cons of all of that, knowing all the information about what could happen if I chose to do that. Later that evening, after the membrane sweep, I did have what seemed like might be the start of my labor. I was starting to have some contractions, some cramping, and they were coming. They just were kind of irregular. And because we lived an hour away from the hospital, we went ahead and headed over to the hospital to find out if things were going, assuming the membrane sweep must have worked, my body is starting to kick in naturally, and we're going to have this baby. We get there, and my contractions are barely doing anything, and they're fading away. So I get told to walk around the hospital for the next 2 hours, going up and down flights of stairs until the contractions become more regular and intense. Well, being a good patient that I am, I did just that. By this time, my mom was in town because we had already decided that if the membrane sweep didn't work, we would go ahead and have the induction. I think we even had it scheduled in hopes that my body would naturally do what it would do with the membrane sweep. But that didn't happen. And what ended up happening is that I was exhausted. My body was drained. Physically, I was struggling to walk after all the up and down in those stairwells. And so when I went back and they monitored, the contractions had not changed. They were either the same or less, and they told me to just go ahead on home and wait and see if anything picks up. Nothing picked up. We went ahead and went forward with our scheduled elective induction, and by this time, my in-laws were on their way into town. We got to the hospital on September 5th, Labor Day, at like 4 or 5 in the morning and began the process of induction. Now, what I didn't know, again, was that with the process of induction, I would be having all these wires all over me, not wires, but like all these IVs and different things to me that I would pretty much be stuck in the bed as the contractions started to come. And I didn't know that they were going to be increasing the Pitocin pretty much every hour and without any kind of notice. So the contractions started to intensify over time, and it literally started to freak me out because I thought, if this is how it is and I'm just getting started, I don't think there's any way I can have an unmedicated birth. So after my in-laws arrived, they went with my mom and got lunch for my husband. I wasn't allowed to eat. Another thing I wasn't really aware of. And my husband stayed with me. They all went out to lunch. I finally felt safe enough to admit that I was struggling through the induced contractions that I was starting to have. And I looked my husband in the eyes and I said, I know that I told you I don't want an epidural, and that is not my plan, and I know that we talked about it, but I need the epidural. So I get, if there's anything you hear from any of my posts, I understand and can sympathize with what it is to feel like you cannot move forward with this unmedicated birth, especially if you've been induced. The contractions, having had an induction and having had natural birth, my births naturally begin on their own, I can tell you personally that they are absolutely not the same. The intensity, not the same at all. And so when it comes to whether or not you choose to have an epidural, whether you've been induced or whether your labor started on its own, I understand that that is an option that when it's available, there are times where we need to choose that, and each mom has freedom to make that decision for herself. What I will always advocate is for education, 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 so that if one of the potential risks ends up coming into fruition, you at least were informed and you knew that that was a possibility, rather than in hindsight finding out, man, if I would have known, I wouldn't have made that decision. That is for me the most important thing as a childbirth educator when I provide education to my clients, is letting you know of, yes, this is an excellent option. Yes, it works wonders when it works, but understand that these other things could come of it. And you'll want to be prepared for what that may look like and what your decision will be if that comes. You'll want to have your decision already made when the question comes up, rather than having to make decisions on the spot with very little information. So, I'll stop there on that little soapbox, but I understood. I asked for the epidural, and what I didn't know is that it would take probably another hour before the anesthesiologist would even make it, because they were out to lunch. And when they did, finally, it was such a relief, and they started the process of doing the epidural, and they could not find the spot. And that was when it started to freak me out even more. This whole, what if it doesn't work? What if I end up paralyzed? What if, like, all the what ifs of what was happening. And there was no changing my mind in my head because they had already started. It ended up taking the anesthesiologist about 6 or 7 attempts. And in that process, he says to me, "Did you know you have a curved spine?" Which, no, I did not know that. And no provider has ever told me that since then. And I've been to several chiropractors. So I don't know if that was just something he was saying to cover his struggle with getting it in the right spot, but each time freaked me out, because I knew that each time he attempted to find the spot, there was risk, 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 risk. I at least knew that. So once he found it and everything was set, I was so happy. It absolutely did work. I can attest to when an epidural works, it is wonderful, as far as removing the pain and helping you sleep and all of that. But it led to me not being able to feel anything at all, and in the end feeling super disconnected from my daughter after she was born. I nearly ended up in an emergency C-section. I use quotation marks because, knowing what I know now, I understand that the decisions that I made leading up to when I would be pushing actually were contributing to why I was struggling with pushing, why we were struggling to get my baby out, which nearly ended us in an emergency C-section. And I say emergency because that wouldn't have been an emergency, in my opinion. That could have been preventable had I chosen differently. And so I ended up pushing for, I want to say, for about an hour or two. And my OB finally told me, I need you to push. The pushes that you're doing aren't working. I couldn't feel. I had the epidural. I didn't know how I was pushing. And she said, if you do not push this baby out in these next few pushes, I'm going to have to take you back. Like, there's no other option. That triggered whatever strength and motivation in me to push with everything that I had to get her out. And thankfully, I was successful in birthing her without having the intervention of a C-section, which was my greatest fear personally. Immediately, they put her on me, and nurses were around just drying her up. The cord was cut. She was taken to the warmer. Everyone flocks with her to the warmer, and I'm here on this hospital bed with my OB checking on me, making sure everything else is going well, and feeling like is that it? Like, are we done? Is it over? Is that what this all, like, why am I not feeling all the, like, I don't know, the excitement? And it was, the feelings were slow, and that could have been for multiple reasons. But physically, I felt numb and disconnected from the entire process, and it made it difficult for me to really become present with my daughter in those first few weeks. Maybe it didn't look like that on the surface to other people, but emotionally and internally, it was a struggle. I never got checked or tested or had any conversation about postpartum anxiety or depression, but years after, as I've talked to counselors about my experience, some have wondered if that may have been influencing some of those first few months as a mother for the very first time. With all that said, those were the reasons, the three things that influenced me to make that decision. And then how the birth ended up going is what influenced me to do everything I could the next time around to have a different experience, because I did not want to have that again. Now you know the why I chose to have an elective induction, the three things that led to that: my excitement, impatience, and lack of education, and how that decision influenced my birth as a first-time mom, and why I now choose to approach birth completely different every birth after that. In my next video, I'm going to share with you some of my top birthing prep tips for first-time moms. Now, these tips are going to be applicable whether you're a first-time mom, second-time mom, whatever the case may be. But I especially encourage first-time moms to consider these tips as you decide what your birth plans are going to be and prepare for the day of your little one being born. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it helpful, please hit that like button down below and maybe share it with a friend who you think might benefit from it.